When a racist cop's brutal assault on a black woman FBI agent goes viral, the world demands justice. But what happens when the truth about both the cop and the agent threatens to unravel everything? In a battle for accountability, both are forced to confront the shadows of their pasts, where the line between justice and revenge becomes dangerously blurred. It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind where everything seems to hum with an unsettling calm before the storm. Detective James Carson, a veteran cop with a reputation for being harsh but effective, never expected the events of that night to spiral out of control. He'd seen riots, he'd seen protests, but tonight was different. He was called to respond to a domestic disturbance in a rundown part of the city, an area known for its high crime rate and tension between the community and law enforcement. As Carson stepped out of his squad car, he noticed the woman immediately, Agent Leah Carter of the FBI, standing tall, her expression one of determination but also caution. The two had never met before, but in the world of law enforcement, everyone had heard of Agent Carter, a sharp, no-nonsense agent who had risen quickly through the ranks. "Can I help you, officer?" Leah asked, her voice cool and professional. Her posture was relaxed, but Carson could sense the underlying tension in her eyes. "I'm here to handle this, Carter," Carson snapped, his tone dismissive. His eyes scanned the area, where the crowd had started to gather. Tension was thick, and he knew the last thing they needed was an FBI agent sticking her nose in his business. "I'm with the investigation," Leah replied, her calmness masking a sense of unease. She wasn't here to cause trouble, but the situation was already on the verge of escalating. "I need to make sure everything's handled appropriately. Just follow my lead." But Carson wasn't interested in taking orders, least of all from someone like her. The situation began to grow volatile as the crowd started shouting at the officers. Carson, irritated and growing impatient, made his way toward a suspect, a young man who was beginning to resist arrest. As he reached for the suspect, Leah stepped forward, trying to de-escalate the situation. "James, this isn't the way. We can handle this without violence," Leah urged, stepping in between Carson and the suspect. But Carson was too far gone. The heat of the moment, the pressure from the crowd, and his ego all collided in an instant. In a flash, his hand shot out, pushing Leah back with brutal force. She stumbled, her hand falling to the ground as she steadied herself, shocked and furious. The crowd erupted in outrage. A bystander, already recording the chaos, caught every moment on camera. "Hey, you can't just do that," someone screamed. The video quickly spread across social media, and within minutes it was viral. Leah stood there, seething with rage but also hurt, her hand still stinging from the force of the shove. The video, now circulating online, painted Carson as the villain, in a story that had yet to unfold completely. The world had seen it, the way he had pushed her aside, dismissing her authority, all because of her race. Back at the station, the phone calls began coming in. From reporters, from activists, from the city council, from everywhere. The video had sparked fury, and people were demanding action. But as the firestorm brewed, Leah couldn't shake one thought from her mind. Was it just a moment of frustration? Or was there something darker at play here? She had to know the truth. But getting it would mean facing a system that had always protected its own. The night after the video went viral, the city was a powder keg waiting to explode. Social media was ablaze with outrage, hashtags trending in every corner of the internet. Justice for Leah, end police brutality, and of course, on fire Carson. The once quiet detective, known for his rough-around-the-edges approach to policing, was now the subject of nationwide scorn. Leah sat in her small apartment, staring at the flickering TV screen. News anchors were dissecting the video frame by frame, while political pundits and social media influencers debated the significance of Carson's actions. For a brief moment, she considered reaching out to her family or friends for comfort, but she quickly dismissed the thought. They'd never understand. No one understood the weight of what she had just experienced. But it wasn't just the shove that was eating at her. It was the way Carson had looked at her, the dismissiveness, the assumption that she was nothing more than an obstacle in his way. She'd been in law enforcement long enough to know when someone thought they were untouchable, and Carson had that look in his eyes. He had gotten away with far too much for far too long. Leah's phone buzzed. It was a message from her superior at the FBI, Agent Mason Walker. Mason. Carter, we need to talk. The video is all over the place, but I need you to stay focused. We're launching an internal investigation, but keep it quiet for now. We don't need to fuel the flames until we know what we're dealing with. Leah stared at the message. She had expected as much. An internal investigation, more red tape, and more waiting. But this wasn't just about following protocol. This was personal now. She couldn't just let Carson get away with this. The system had failed her before, and she wasn't going to let it fail again. She quickly typed a response. Leah, I'm going after him, Mason. This won't be buried. I'll find out everything, and I won't stop until Carson faces the consequences. Mason's reply was quick, a stern warning. Mason. Leah, you need to think this through. We can't afford to let your emotions drive this. We're on the brink of a public crisis. Stay focused. Leah felt her temper flare. Stay focused? She had spent her career staying focused, doing everything by the book. And where had that gotten her? Pushed aside, humiliated, her life upended by a single cruel moment? No more, she muttered to herself. Meanwhile, across town, Carson was struggling to keep his composure. His phone was blowing up with calls from his colleagues demanding answers, some of them offering support while others turned their backs on him. The higher-ups were quiet, but he could feel their judgment weighing down on him. The force, the system that had always had his back, was now beginning to fracture. The video was undeniable. The shove was clear. But was it enough to destroy him? He had his doubts. He'd seen other cops take hits like this and survive. The question was, could he? Would the department protect him, or was this the end of his career? Then his phone rang. It was Captain Griggs, a longtime friend who had been on the force even longer than Carson. James, we need to talk, Griggs said. His voice was serious, and Carson immediately knew this wasn't just a friendly check-in. I know, Carson replied, his voice tight. I'm seeing it all over the news. What the hell is happening? Look, the department is trying to distance itself from this, but you're not just dealing with a push. That video is being framed as something much worse. You know how the public is. This isn't going away. I didn't do anything wrong, Griggs. She stepped in my way, and I told her to stay out of it. It's not my fault she got in the way. I know. But the problem is, they don't see it that way. The whole world is seeing you as the villain in this. And that woman, Leah Carter, she's got a reputation. She won't stop. Carson's heart sank. He hadn't known much about Leah Carter beyond her badge number, but now that he heard her name on the lips of his colleagues, he understood she was not someone to be underestimated. I'm done for, aren't I? Carson whispered. Griggs didn't answer right away. The silence spoke volumes. You've got to fix this, James, fast. If this gets out of hand, there's no coming back. Leah sat in a small, dimly lit diner the next morning, trying to gather her thoughts. She was on her way to meet a source who claimed to know Carson from his past. If there was any chance of uncovering the truth, this was her best lead. The city was buzzing with anger, but for Leah, the real battle was just beginning. The public outrage wasn't enough. She needed facts, the kind of proof that couldn't be disputed. And the more she dug into Carson's past, the more she suspected that the violent encounter wasn't just a random outburst. As she stood up to leave, her phone buzzed again. It was a notification about the latest video footage making its rounds. Another angle of the confrontation, this time showing the moments before the shove. In the new footage, Carson's face was clearly contorted with anger. His eyes filled with something more than just frustration. Something darker. Leah's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a power struggle between two officers. This was something much deeper, something that Carson was hiding, and she was going to uncover it no matter the cost. The sun was barely rising, casting a faint light over the streets of the city. Leah had been up all night, poring over every piece of information she could find about Carson. His records, his past cases, even the small-town rumors that had followed him throughout his career. But nothing prepared her for what she was about to uncover. Her meeting with the source, a former colleague of Carson's named Marcus Brooks, had been set for the corner booth of a dingy diner on the outskirts of town. Brooks had contacted her late last night, claiming he had crucial information about Carson's behavior. Things that weren't caught on the viral video, but things that could take him down for good. Leah arrived early, the weight of the investigation already heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. This was a battle to protect the very idea of accountability in a system that had too often shielded its own. The whole world was watching, and this time she wouldn't let them down. When Marcus arrived, he was an older man with a grizzled face, his tired eyes betraying years of dealing with the corruption and violence in the force. He slid into the booth across from her, glancing nervously over his shoulder before speaking. "You're Leah Carter, right?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from too many cigarettes and too little sleep. "That's me," Leah replied, leaning forward. "What do you know about James Carson?" He hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust her. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Carson, he's got a temper. And it's not just that video you saw. There's more to him. Stuff the department's been covering up for years." Leah's heart raced. "What kind of stuff?" Marcus looked over his shoulder again, as if someone might be listening. "I worked with Carson for over a decade. When I first started, I looked up to him. He was a legend in the department, respected. But as time went on, I saw things that didn't sit right. He was always angry, always ready to snap. I remember a few cases where suspects got roughed up, nothing too obvious, but enough to make me wonder." Leah frowned, pressing for more. "What happened to those cases? Were they ever investigated?" Marcus shook his head. "No. Carson had connections, people in high places. Whenever something happened that could cause trouble, it would get swept under the rug. The higher-ups knew, but they turned a blind eye. They always did." Leah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about a single incident, it was about a pattern of misconduct. Carson had been getting away with it for years, and now the entire system was starting to crack. "Did anyone ever try to stop him?" Leah asked. Marcus shook his head again, his eyes hardening. "People tried, but they got crushed. You don't stand up to Carson without consequences. Ask around. There's more out there. Cases that never saw the light of day." Leah's mind raced. If Carson had been involved in these other cases, there was a chance the video wasn't just a glimpse into one violent outburst. It could be the key to uncovering a much larger network of corruption. She thanked Marcus and left the diner, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She needed more evidence. More proof that Carson's actions were part of a broader issue within the department. If she could find that, she could bring him down. Meanwhile, Carson was spiraling. The pressure was mounting. The video had gone viral, and the public was relentless in their demands for justice. Protests were beginning to spread throughout the city, with people taking to the streets, chanting for his resignation. It wasn't just about the shove anymore. It was about everything that had been ignored for so long. Carson sat at his desk in the small, dimly lit office at the precinct, staring blankly at the pile of paperwork in front of him. He hadn't slept in days, and his nerves were shot. Every call he received seemed to make his situation worse, and his own thoughts were turning against him. What had he done? He had always prided himself on his ability to control the situation. But now, he was no longer in control. The city was turning against him, and with every passing hour it seemed more and more likely that his career would be over. His reputation, built over decades of service, was being destroyed by a single viral video. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he'd been avoiding for weeks. Captain Griggs. "James," Griggs answered, his voice tight. "We need to talk. This is getting out of hand." "I know," Carson said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to fix this. I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would go this far." Griggs was silent for a moment, then said, "You need to lay low. Let the department handle this, but you've got to stay out of sight for now. We'll manage the PR, but there's nothing more you can do at this point. Just keep quiet." Carson's hands clenched into fists as he slammed them on the desk. This isn't just about a PR campaign, Griggs. It's about my life, my career, and that woman, Leah Carter. She's digging into me. She's going to ruin me. Griggs sighed, clearly exhausted by the entire situation. Just hold on, James. We'll find a way to handle it. But you've got to be smart about this. Carson hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, staring at the walls that seemed to close in on him. The weight of his actions, of everything he had done over the years, was crashing down on him. And now, there was no way out. Leah continued to dig, her investigation now turning into something much bigger than a single act of police brutality. She had found whispers of corruption, of secret deals and cover-ups that had gone unnoticed for years. Carson wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symptom of a much deeper problem. But as the pressure mounted, both for Carson and for her, she knew one thing. The truth was out there, and she would stop at nothing to expose it. The city was on the edge, the atmosphere thick with tension as the protests grew louder, fiercer. What had started as a single viral video had turned into a nationwide movement. Justice for Leah Carter, justice for every victim whose cries had been ignored by a corrupt system. Carson could feel it in every interaction, every glance he received. His name had become synonymous with abuse of power, and his world was crumbling around him. Leah was relentless. She had pulled every string she could, diving deeper into Carson's past, uncovering connections to unsolved cases that no one had dared to look at for years. It was clear now. Carson wasn't just a rogue cop. He had been part of something far darker. The more Leah uncovered, the more she realized that his actions weren't just isolated incidents. They were the tip of the iceberg in a systemic problem that ran deep within the department. But her pursuit of justice had come with its own cost. Threats began to surface, anonymous messages warning her to back off. She had been followed, her every move scrutinized. It wasn't just Carson's career on the line anymore, it was hers as well. But Leah had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to stop. Not now. The confrontation. Leah stood outside the police precinct, staring up at the building that had once symbolized law and order, now nothing more than a fortress of corruption. She had gathered everything she needed, documents, files, witness statements, all the evidence that could bring down not just Carson, but the entire network of corruption that had been silently thriving in the shadows. Inside, Carson was a broken man. His pride, his career, everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. He hadn't left his office in days, his only company the constant ringing of his phone, the endless barrage of messages from the media, from his colleagues, from his superiors. And then there was Leah. She was everywhere now. On the news, on social media, in the streets, leading the charge for accountability. But she wasn't just after him anymore. She was after the truth. As he sat in his office, staring at the file before him, a knock at the door broke his concentration. Without looking up, he spoke. "What now?" The door opened, and in walked Agent Mason Walker, Leah's superior. His face was grim, and his posture was rigid. He had come to deliver the final blow. "Carson, it's over," Mason said, his voice cold. "We've got the evidence. The department's not going to protect you anymore. The FBI is taking over." Carson's world collapsed in that moment. His hands trembled as he looked at the folder Mason placed on the desk in front of him. It was thick, filled with documents that detailed everything, every dirty secret, every case he had covered up, every act of brutality. Leah had done it. She had exposed him for what he was. "Leah," Carson whispered, his voice a mixture of fear and disbelief. "She's behind." This Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. The final showdown. Leah entered the precinct, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had spent weeks building this case, collecting every shred of evidence that could bring Carson to justice. Today was the day it all came to a head. She walked past the rows of officers, their eyes following her, some with pity, others with disdain. The air felt thick, as though the entire precinct was holding its breath. But Leah didn't waver. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to end the cycle of abuse and corruption that had plagued this department for far too long. When she entered Carson's office, the tension was palpable. He sat at his desk, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who had once commanded respect now looked like a shadow of himself. Leah stood before him, the evidence she had gathered laid out in front of her. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "It's over, Carson," she said, her voice cold but resolute. "You're done." Carson didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was clouded with regret, but more than that, fear. Fear of losing everything he had built. He had never imagined it would end like this, not in such a public, humiliating defeat. But Leah was right. He had pushed too far this time. Leah moved to the desk and placed a single file in front of him. It was the file that would destroy him. His past, his connections, the cases he had buried. Everything. "You thought you were untouchable," Leah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard you try to hide it." For the first time in years, Carson felt something other than rage. Guilt. It was there, buried beneath the anger and pride, a slow burn of realization. He had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. Leah turned and walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she paused. "This isn't just about you, Carson," she said, her voice heavy with meaning. "This is about everyone who has suffered because of people like you. You might be the one going down today, but it's only the beginning." With that, Leah left the office, leaving Carson alone with the wreckage of his own making. Epilogue. A new beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur. The news of Carson's downfall spread quickly, shaking the very foundations of the department. The protests grew even louder, demanding justice not just for Leah, but for all the victims who had been ignored for far too long. The investigation into Carson led to the exposure of several other officers who had been involved in similar misconduct, and for the first time in years, it felt like real change was possible. Leah, now a symbol of resilience and justice, stood before the crowds at a rally, her voice strong and unwavering as she addressed those who had supported her through the storm. "This isn't over," Leah declared, her words carrying a weight of conviction. "This is just the beginning. We're going to keep fighting because the truth doesn't stop with one victory. We're going to make sure that the system works for everyone. No matter their color, no matter their background, this is our reckoning." As the crowd erupted into applause, Leah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The battle had been hard, and it wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she was finally on the right side of history.